I tried to get into pharmaceutical sales, but they basically told me, we only hire men. See, back then, your health insurance only lasted 6 months on your parents. So I had to find a job to get health insurance. It wasn't until the age of 26. So what happened was I had a friend whose father was a burn surgeon in Philadelphia. He said there's this National Diabetes Research Interchange that needs the tissue procurement coordinator, AKA I did autopsies for a year. I procured transplant or autopsy tissue for diabetes research, but it carried science experience and I had health insurance. After that, I still tried to apply for a pharma position, and back then there were no computers, so I saw an advertisement in the paper that said United Healthcare is recruiting physician coordinators. And I said, aha, that kind of like pharma experience because I'm getting doctors to join this managed care program, and I got hired. I had 2 years of experience of managed care. So in '85, I got hired as a pharma rep. It was my third job, first pharmaceutical. I had a phenomenal first manager and mentor who protected me as a woman. He says, you stay with me, I'm protecting you. But about a year later, I was in a doctor's office and I ran into a serial rep who sold cardiovascular medicine. He said, yeah, we're taking the doctors to Bimini, snorkeling and scuba. And I speechless, and I called my manager on a payphone because there were no cell phones, and I said, did you hear about this? And that's how the trip all started with one company. My eyes were like saucer until my company, which was Carter Wallace, started getting these ideas of Dr. Lunches, Dine and Dash. It just exploded. My line was, I don't feel comfortable doing this. If I said I won't do it, it's considered insubordination, and HR, who is not your friend, would get rid of you. A colleague of mine, Pete, he was fired, and he called me and said, hey, you're still working for Questcor. I need you to come in because you could provide a lot more evidence for the case. I was divorced, I had a special needs son, I had a lot of debt from the divorce, and I needed to work. So I never make a decision right away. So I say, give me a week maximum. I have to think about it. That week I had a patient program, which is where Questcor and other companies have physicians or nurses talk to the patients about a drug. Usually it's off-label and the patient go back to their doctor and demand the drug. I had this patient program and it was for multiple sclerosis patient. I was going to the bathroom and this woman, Melanie, was about 32 years old. She followed me and she had a cane. Before I got in the bathroom, she said, Lisa, is Acthar going to help me? And I also learned she was diagnosed with lymphoma. She said, is this drug going to make me better? And as a sales rep, only the physician can answer that question. So I told her, yeah, the corporate line you have to ask the doctor who's giving the talk or your family neurologist. I went in the bathroom, I lost it. I broke down. It took me a while to get my act together to come back. After that dinner, I called Pete and I said, I'm in. Who's gonna fight for these patients? Questcor was dosing the drug at a suboptimal dose, and the patient who had an attack never got better. The patients, when they have an attack, are treated with Acthar, and they have to be on it 3 or 4 weeks, not 5 days. Medicare wasn't going to pay for it unless they compared it to a steroid, which was used for 3 to 4 days. When I first heard that in training, I went, what did I do taking this job? I was friends with private investigators, cops, lawyers. They said, you have to sell by the package insert, which I always did. And I would say to my manager, I don't feel comfortable selling off label. And I told him I don't look good in orange if I go to jail. And the food's terrible. I was in shock because this was the worst. An MS patient, if you have an attack, key is to treat that attack and get them back to baseline so they don't progress in their disease. With this drug, felt better, but they never got back to baseline. And I would see these people come back to these patient programs. First they were walking, then they came in with a cane, then they went to a wheelchair. So I knew they were progressing in their disease and had taken Acthar subtherapeutically. At about 8 weeks, my son started having febrile seizures that were 30 minutes long. Some of them required helicopter visits to formerly AI DuPont, where we started. Back then, nobody really knew how to diagnose autism. He's 27 now. I basically was the advocate in order to find a diagnosis, in order to find treatment, and also education. And it brought me to my knees because there wasn't a diagnosis. But eventually we found Dr. Weller, who was at University of Pennsylvania. And with Dr. Weller was the path to getting him a diagnosis and under control, advocating him to go to a special school, take its toll, but I had to. He was So when the opportunity came to be a whistleblower, I've been there. I knew being a whistleblower, this isn't over in 6 months. Having advocated for those that don't have a voice, and the piece de resistance is my son, I was ready. I was more than ready because these MS patients I equated to my son. They had no voice. He was getting better. They were getting worse. So when Pete, my colleague who got fired, asked me, it was an easy choice. It was a gift to be able to do this. Well, I said, who is going to speak for these people? All the companies I worked for were corrupt. Nobody spoke for me. Who is going to help them? Somebody has to. And I said, I'm going to roll the dice like playing craps. I have to do it. I knew that I would be Jane Doe for a while. I'll deal with going public later. I didn't think about that. I just had to disassociate my emotions and think of it as a third job. And I just said, I'm going to be relentless and bring Questcor down. I want them to their knees for what they've done. I volunteered. I wasn't nervous because, in my opinion, I've never had people say that you have done great or a good job. And I told my 2 attorneys that I am going to be the DOJ's best relator. I am moldable. I follow advice, which I did. Even as an employee, I was like Gumby. I'm alpha, but I can listen and take criticism. And I listened to my 2 attorneys because I knew they were the experts. I looked at it as a job, and there were thousands of pages of evidence that I faxed, notes I wrote on my pants at meetings. I ruined pants by writing notes. I wrote them on cocktail napkins. I wrote things like in school, underneath your palm in grade school, you write a note, show somebody. The DOJ said, we have so much evidence. I volunteered to be wired. They said, we've got a plethora of evidence. I volunteered. I was going to do everything in my power. And one of the things they told me, this is a marathon and it could go a long time, and they were correct. You just have to stay focused and not let your head make you go crazy, because a lot of whistleblowers that they had wound up being hospitalized. Well, when I became public, it was a different story. I was getting drive-bys, hang-ups. I got Rottweilers. And I said, look, can they help me? No, but if you die, the government can get 3 times the amount of money. I was like, no, I'm on my own. I even asked my local cops to do patrol, and they thought it was a joke. I'm a single parent. So I started collecting Rottweiler. I was getting doctors trying to call. My phone was blowing up. And then I was getting drive-bys, stop, look at my house, and it wasn't for sale. So I called my attorneys and I said, talk to the DOJ. I'm all by myself here. And they said, we don't protect people. It lasted a couple years. They were going to go criminal, but I discovered basically with the Department of Justice, it was just too much time and money in order to do a criminal case and go to trial. But they decided to go civil, and I provided so much evidence, they take the low-hanging fruit in order to prosecute. The easiest infractions are bribes. So that's what they did, but mail and fraud only settled 10% of the case. The thing was, we're going to prepare for trial. I was practicing depositions. I had to meet with the DOJ, and the head from Augie Ripa came from Washington to grill me for about 6 hours to see how I would do as a federal witness on this stand. We didn't go to trial. We almost were, but then all of a sudden, Mallinckrodt hit the news and they were involved in the opioid crisis, the other division. And I told my attorneys they're going to claim bankruptcy. And they are sweet talking the government. This was my opinion. We're not going to go to trial. They're just going to be like that bad boyfriend who doesn't want to keep going on dates and, oh, we'll go next week. And that's what they were doing. And 14 months later, Mallinckrodt went bankrupt. And that's why they only settled 10% of the case, because they knew that they were going to get sued. They were the third worst opioid offender on the opioid end. There is one website people can go on before they go see a doctor, openpaymentsdata.cms.gov. Type in your doctor, and I would suggest doing it before you see your doctor. My theory is a patient should know the answers before they ask those questions to see if their physician is on the take or lying. I also suggest they go to legal websites to see if they've been named in a lawsuit. I always like to see if they've been named in a lawsuit, and you can't find it in Google. Just want people to be enraged, because to me, healthcare in general and the pharma industry is completely broken. And if people demand change to their local congressman or senator, this is the only way our system is going to be corrected. And I also want them to see that you can't be an advocate, because the only one that's going to help you is you. Nobody cares about you. Don't assume your doctor cares. They don't care. Managed care has destroyed this in physicians. All those little tips and homework have to demand what you want. So be your own advocate. Don't assume they're God and put them on a pedestal. I think with the rise of managed care, it cut most of their salaries in half. You're limited what they get for a Medicare patient or a commercial patient. That's it. So that means what they were used to 12 years ago has been cut in half. Hence, the pharma companies come in with all the bribes and kickbacks. They used to care years ago. Nobody cares.